Hello, yeah, I'm James, and in 2015 I started Automaton with Mark Gerhard from Jagex and brought on a number of other people who'd worked on traditional MMOs as well as some AAA games. And we set out with quite a technically focused vision to create a next generation for this sort of game, which has been rooted in quite old technology for a while. So we really set out with this vision to create a sort of tactical shooting game that involves a lot of interactions at a mass scale between a lot of players, but also a massive amount of progression in terms of how we actually simulate the world and use that in gameplay. So today I'm specifically here to talk about Mavericks, our upcoming title, sort of massively multiplayer shooter, which sort of delivers on high fidelity worlds, a large game world that's also dynamic, as well as quite realistic high fidelity. And tactical. So coming out in closed beta in summer this year. Today, I'll focus on exactly what we do to sort of build a world that encompasses aspects that have been done separately in different games, whether a high-quality single-player experience or a really universe-scale multiplayer experience. But this project's really about bringing that all together into a sort of an epic shooter. So here's a top-down view of the 16-kilometer diameter map of the Mavericks Proving Grounds. It's pretty massive, and the first step here for making this kind of game possible is for us to not use a single server kind of architecture. Instead, we're working with Improbable on using many dynamically scaling workers which simulate different parts of the world, and say there's a significant density of players. In one area, it will scale and make sure that everyone has extremely high simulation rate in that particular area, no matter what kind of density or scale of the overall simulation. So when you've seen sort of recent games doing like 100-player shooters, things like that, and compromising on quality of the actual simulation, we really have to take a fundamentally different approach to solve that. So we don't at all use a single server, we use a network, and we actually have millions of entities across this world. So while the dots there will represent players, there are actually many, many thousand times more individual entities, single trees, grass which can be deformed, like foot trails, destructible entities, and all these things throughout the world. There is absolutely no way in which you could actually see all of that at one time on your client. So we focus on building separated out network of simulation for all of those entities, and then a sort of smart client which can only stream in what it needs. So the key focus there is an entity hierarchy, which means that something far away can be represented in a small summary that you can still see. So you can still see far away, but only what you need to stream in. So taking this sort of server approach, if I can go forward a slide. Can I go forward? Oh, that sort of worked. So it's not just about a load of servers and a different kind of network approach that we're doing with Spatial OS, but it's also about how you then bring that back on the client. So we're working on CryEngine, which is a fully real-time focused engine, and that means that everything you see is 100% dynamic and real-time, so it can be destroyed, can be streamed in and out, which means that we'll gradually bring in the world as you move around, but not just sort of load chunk, but actually understand the structure of the detail in the world, and therefore be able to do sort of level of detail techniques, which mean that we can basically say a house that's far away, because I only see the outside, that's the outside right now, or potentially large-scale modifications to that house, but as you go in, it's every single entity inside that house. Using this sort of combination of real-time realistic rendering with new kinds of like server architecture, we can get something that's really dynamic, very well simulated, but still, a sort of fun action-based experience. But the real last element of this to make it sort of unique and sort of progressive in what we're doing is that it's not just about the level of simulation, the level of quality. It's also about the level of thought that goes into the world, because there are many games, that have tried, already very ambitious, but at the end of the day, they might make massive worlds with quite high quality, but they're also like procedurally generated. They don't necessarily lend themselves to tactical gameplay. So from a game design point of view, we've really structured our teams to work specifically on a very thoughtful level design process. So you might, if you look at a traditional AAA shooter, it will have a small map that's really well designed and lends itself to tactical gameplay. If you look at an open world shooter, sort of battle royale game, these sorts of things, you'll end up with a lot of emptiness, and it can be fun. It can be an interesting experience, and you get a lot of randomization there. But really, what we're focusing on is sort of doing that more consistently and creating a lot more tactics within the world. So rather than just flat out a load of assets across a map, our design team also works on these. If you look at number one, they're like these modular pieces that we think are interesting gameplay, and we map all of those out, and then through a 3-step process, which goes through art and then placement into the map, like block-out testing. We have all these individual kinds of gameplays, funneling, tactical, like positioning of certain kinds of destructible entities, and these mean that we actually balance risk, reward, and autonomy, how the terrain is built based on gameplay. So we focus on, at the moment, we focus a lot of testing on this 500-kilometer square island, which combines about 12 of these kinds of gameplay zones, and then to progress out 100 times bigger to a very large-scale map, we can then sort of reuse the core modules, but still have very unique assets and very unique combinations of all those assets throughout the world. Obviously, it's a game designed to look very good, very realistic, and these games have existed. There have been good-looking games in the past. Recently, you may have heard there's been a lot of use of photogrammetry and sort of physically based rendering in games, which has made it a lot more efficient to build really good-looking, realistic games. What we've done is focused on using photogrammetry, libraries of assets that are physically correct, because everything in our game is designed to be correct in every lighting condition. Because we have fully day and night, destructibility, loads of kinds of volumetric weather effects, fogging, rain formation, puddle formation. Everything needs to look correct no matter how wet it is, no matter how dark it is outside, no matter what's occluding it. CryEngine's given us a very good starting point for that, and we've been working sort of on that and the combination of the latest sort of photogrammetry libraries and assets we've scanned in. What we found is that that's allowed us to make a realistic looking world many times faster than games have in the last few years. Although just using some of these libraries does sometimes need a second look. Like there are a lot of assets out there that you can get right now to create a realistic looking game, but when you bring them all together, they don't necessarily quite match. So everything we do goes through sort of a checking process where we have tables of real world surfaces that we compare the textures we scan into and make sure that all these different libraries are correct, because there's a lot of processing that goes on as an asset that gets scanned from the real world to go into the game, and consistency is key. So we use a lot of charts, PBR charts and other things to make sure that we calibrate these assets together. And yeah, we end up with a consistent world which has realistic lighting in a lot of conditions. Am I doing the slides or you? Oh, okay, there we go. Talked a bit about dynamic elements. We combine a number of mesh reduction techniques, whether that's a fully dynamic simulation of just entities that you hit and they move around, which we can make limited use of because you sort of have budgets with these things. Although we can do a lot with our distributed server network, the clients also simulate a lot. We use quite a sophisticated sort of state machine technique, which allows our servers to constantly check what your client's doing, and we have a lot of investment in sort of anti-cheat technologies and verification, but we still have the client able to simulate a lot. So there are limits there, and so we use a combination of different destruction techniques depending on what scale of the destruction and what budget we're operating at. So it might be a fully baked simulation of a whole bridge destructing, or here it might be an asset which is pre-broken apart, but if you shoot it in a certain direction, it will break apart differently, or a Boolean operation more like cutting a tree in half at any point you want through your shots, but the actual cut itself is procedural. So there are a number of different compromises we make to make sure that we can give the impression that everything is actually dynamic, even though there's a huge range of different ways we achieve that kind of dynamic behavior. Obviously, playing into that are particle effects and simple surface propagation techniques, like fire will affect the texture on things. A lot of that can be done in 2D, but it will still look 3D when you sort of combine it with particle effects. And finally, foliage displacement. It's hard to illustrate that, I suppose, with a picture. I wish the art team had given me a video, but the idea being that as you walk through the tracks, you cause an impact on the foliage. We have a lot of bendable foliage in the world, all of the grass, all of the trees. So what that means is that you leave trails where you go, and we're creating a much more information-rich experience than what you'll see from like a Battle Royale game on the market today. And that means that there's a lot of stuff to deform and bend. So we use a sort of complement between joints that are simulated, but also this propagation technique where we can just simulate a few joints and based on the same texture across that whole surface, efficiently have a lot of stuff bending, even though it's actually relatively efficient on the GPU. So, I can try a bit to talk if you have various questions about our gameplay, and how what we're doing is bringing together this kind of world simulation into a sort of massive scale Battle Royale style of game. But really, we'll be showcasing the game for the first time at GDC. We have a closed beta this summer. If you're at that event, please join us at the Improbable stand. Otherwise, we will also be sending out a load of information then. So you can sign up on our website as of today, because you may have heard Project X was the sort of working title of the game. We've only announced today our name as Mavericks Proving Grounds. So if you sign up on our website, we'll be sending around emails very shortly.
Okay. Hello. Yeah. Does anyone from the audience have any questions? Yeah.
You guys said you were using like a kind of like distributed kind of worker model for the map. So is each like cluster of workers responsible for a different part of the map, and then they scale up based on where you are? Is that how it works?
Yes. Yeah. So it gives us two things. So this is very much the model that we have worked on with Improbable and Spatial OS. And you can read more on their websites. It's applicable to a lot of kinds of games. The way we specifically use it is there are sort of two main benefits. We separate out physics and dynamics simulation from game logic and player state and other things like that. So we have specific workers which can grow and shrink, not only for a certain part of the world, but they're also only concerned about that task. So say we want to have 1,000 FPS bullets all the time, we can do that, and it's actually quite easy to do. The only reason we keep it more 60 to 100 FPS or 144 FPS is just because that's what the clients themselves do, so there's no point doing more than that. So we can have extremely sort of high tick rate physics because it's dedicated to that stuff, and it scales up and down. There's always a limit at the absolute extremes when you have like 1,000 players on one spot, but that's where we're specifically working on occlusion techniques. So by having it's all about the fact that we separate out the data between all these workers. There's a lot of information across this world. As long as we can say, look, this one area is only being simulated by this set of workers, we stop having to share too much information between too many different systems. And it's really the information that becomes the bottleneck. And that's why, like, even though you could get a really, really powerful server, and try and scale it up that way, that doesn't really let you isolate the data very easily. So it's really a combination of, yes, we scale up and down, we can run much more powerfully than a single server could, but it's really not just about that, it's about a different approach. Like, it's really a different way of thinking about it, and we're very sort of data-oriented in the world. And I think, there's been a lot of popularity recently, the last couple of years, with sort of Battle Royale games, this sort of thing, but at the end of the day, they're just last decade shooters with 100 people instead of one. Like, it's always going to hit that limitation, whereas we sort of started all the way from scratch. And we had to use an engine technology which is fully real time. Like, we can't have light baking and things which mean, like, oh wait, if this changed, now it doesn't apply. And we also had a big focus on really efficient streaming, because the thing is, you need to be able to stream in and out information as you walk through this world. And, like, thankfully, with the sort of track that Crytek were always on with their Crisis games and the sort of mantra to be very dynamic in real time, they had a really good starting point for that kind of technology where other engines could also look good and other approaches can look good, but we needed a starting point that's focused on streaming in and out so that you can actually hand off work and it's not stuck somewhere within that simulation.
Anybody else? Over here?
Hi. Could you spend a few words on the artificial intelligence that you're planning to use for this game, and how it's going to make use of this dynamic world that you're building?
Artificial intelligence. So, specifically, I would say machine learning. So this area of artificial intelligence where rather than necessarily, write some code that says, oh, if players do this, then, actually have some code running which looks at all the different things players are doing and sort of makes its own decision about that based on outcomes that we've looked at. So what we're looking to do is we're going to train the gameplay to. So let me take an example of, say, a zone on the map that spawns that reveals who's there, that could potentially randomly spawn, or damages them, things like that. We can spawn some things at random, and that can create interesting variety in the gameplay, but it can also just be annoying, like it doesn't necessarily achieve anything. But if where that spawn is where it actually spawns and when it spawns is based on a number of other factors of what players are actually doing to each other in the game, then that can potentially start to create interesting tactical gameplay. So what we do is, for some of our game logic, we don't just go, make this random. We go, okay, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve with this? We want players to funnel in this direction. We run 1,000 or more simulations of why that would happen, and then machine learning will let us sort of allow it to continuously evolve, like how it behaves based on what players do in the game. So this is something which is we're going to feature to some extent this year in our sort of more session-oriented last man standing style gameplay. We are also expanding to a more persistent RPG mode in 2019, and that's where we're making extensive use of machine learning. So in that particular mode, you have clan battles that are more persistent. You have things on the map that last longer, and when that starts to happen, you have like you want to try a lot more things based on like a lot of aggregated data, and sometimes we can have game designers look at it and go, okay, it'd be cool if we just force this to happen, but at other times it's actually better if we just sort of create systems which are sort of a bit self-aware as to what the outcomes we want are, and try that out. Because the key thing about massively multiplayer game development that we've learned is you don't really fully understand. If you're making a massively multiplayer game, you can't really understand your game to the fullest extent. Like there are just too many players doing too many things to the game. It's about what everyone's doing to each other. So what we're really focusing on under machine learning are these gameplay elements which we don't claim to say we know the best way of doing something, but we know the outcome we want, and we can allow the game to train and optimize based on that outcome. So it's a very experimental area of what we're doing, and we think it will bring some really cool, unique gameplay. But I think that's something to really talk about over the course of our betas and in the wild, because no one's really done it before, so we're still waiting to see how that really impacts the gameplay.
Hello. While the client will, of course, be required to draw and render everything, so VGAs will play a major part in the client, how heavy will the CPU and bandwidth, internet bandwidth, be for the client?
CPU?
Yeah.
But
with physics being done on the server.
So physics is done on the server and the client. But what the client does is only a specific section that it needs to do. So the focus is that, yeah, the client will simulate local physics. What that allows us to do is be quite intelligent at how we do things like latency compensation. One of the most frustrating parts of FPSs can be how the particular game has chosen to address latency. Like, oh, that guy was lagging, and oh, that's annoying. We do run physics around your local player because it's a useful piece of information to help us make that decision about what happened from the point of view of those two players. But we also do it on the servers. However, the individual client doesn't simulate a lot of physics, so it's not a problem. It focuses only on what it needs to know. So the world and the servers will own, say, the trees that have fallen moving around, displacement of the ground, and they will do almost all the simulation for that, and the client will only see the result. But for the player itself, and for certain elements around the player, it's important to us that we simulate what the client does, because that's the most up-to-date view that you have. And we're trying to achieve both, sort of high-quality Twitch gameplay, like it is a really good quality shooter, as well as has all these components to it. So to get both, we sort of need to do both approaches. And our compromises there are purely down to like when we consider what the client said versus what the server said. And that really plays in, of course, to like things like aim bots and cheating, which is why we do everything on the server. And then we were able to sort of work out if what happened was sensible, like on an ongoing basis. So it's really quite a complex interaction between the local sort of servers that are around your player and your player. But I wouldn't say that physics is an expensive part of what the client's doing. I wouldn't say we're very, very GPU heavy. Also, we're quite good largely thanks to a lot of the work that Crytek had already done on being very good at multi-threaded processing. So like a lot of game engines like hammer one thread really hard and can use other threads to some extent. But actually, we're in quite a good place with that. So we haven't found that physics is particularly expensive for what we're doing.
Anybody else? Yep.
Hi, I just wanted to ask to what extent will be environment destructibility you planning to implement in the game, if any?
To what extent do we have destructibility?
Yeah.
So destructibility at the moment, in what we're playtesting and the sort of stuff we're showcasing in the next couple of months, is going to be so a lot of it's about useful information, useful tactical information from the game. So grass, like foliage displacement, like slightly persistent. So you walk through grass, you leave footprint trails, you adjust slightly how the foliage is laid out. That to us, these sort of trails mean that there's more information around what might have happened. We complement that with other systems that could lead to confusion, so like wildlife, things like that, which can also do the same thing, so that there's a lot more information there, but it's not just, oh, there's definitely a player and he went that way. So a lot of it's based on the foliage. We're not really hard set on like making it so that you just gun down every tree around it, but trees are destructible. However, not just by like a pistol or something. So again, for us, this is about like not adding things like armor-style gameplay where it's really hard to do something, like to use a gun, and it's not supposed to be super hard and realistic in that sense. But on the world simulation, we try and push it as far as we can. So our initial stages are, we do include tree simulation. We do include destructibility in the houses, for example. So a house has different walls, some of which you can break in different ways than others. So you can sort of break in through certain parts, and the textures on the house represent, to some extent, how breakable it is. So like, but if you're inside a house, like all the banisters break, like the fences outside, they all break. So you can throw a grenade and blow off a wall of the house. So we do have a lot of, we had a lot of work in that area to make sure we had good siege gameplay in effect. So I would say the key areas really are around buildings, trees, and foliage.
Actually, on that point, can you talk a bit about the animal behavior and how that factors into the player's experience?
So at the moment, the animal behavior itself is quite straightforward. We're yet to do like something really smart from the animal point of view. I mean, it's something we're interested in. At the moment, the reason why it's good is because you can place animals in and they can affect the world in a similar way to a human. Like an NPC can give you that ambiguity. So you can walk up to something, disturb something, and it causes either a noise or it causes a trail. So we have pretty standard behavior on that stuff so far, and we think that adds a lot to the game. We are looking to obviously investigate it further, although we're also not trying to make this a meta of like animal herding. Like this is a tactical shooter, so I wouldn't say it's that we've done something really complex with animal behavior, but the standard stuff, but in this setting where the world itself reacts to the animal as well as to you, is quite impactful because you then use that as information in the game session.
So it's like one element of a suite of dynamic systems that build your immersion.
Yeah, so basically deer, like birds, like they do simple stuff, but it actually can have quite a big effect, especially if you sort of manipulate it a bit. It's almost like manipulating it, the fact that it's dumb is almost a good bit of gameplay. You don't expect a deer to outsmart you, like, necessarily. It's just send it that way and, oh, like someone else thinks, did someone come from that direction? And then if it spots another player, actually, it moves away from them as well. So it's pretty much more like it moves away from you. That sort of logic is what we're testing right now.
How about in terms of like social systems? Because it's specifically in terms of last man standing, it's fairly simple. You shoot the dude, but obviously you've got ambitions beyond that as well.
Sorry, animation?
Ambitions
beyond.
Ambition.
Oh, okay. Yes, I would say, although there's a lot, I think without us going into all the details we want to announce in the next couple of months about our game mode itself, I wouldn't say the last man standing in our game mode is as much all there is. I mean, we have, because we have sort of things that come down throughout the session that allow you to fight over them, and there was more intermediate sort of mid-game gameplay in our game. Like, it's sort of fun throughout the game, we see, rather than just like really fun at the beginning, really fun at the end in our session-based gameplay. But on top of that, from launch this year, we do also have the central capital, so the social hub with a tower, like large tower at its center, which you don't enter this game through a menu, you enter it through the social hub. So it's a bit more like a traditional MMO in that sense. But not to take away from the session gameplay, but because you can track your progression, interact with a lot of kinds of vendors and new kinds of like prestige and progression systems in the game, actually earn guns and other things in the persistent part of the world. And yes, you can go out into these competitive game sessions, but you can also go out into the open world. Initially, that's more of a casual experience. But as I say, down the line, certainly for the end of 2019, we are doing a expansion to that and really investigating the RPG nature of the open world. At the moment, I would say, we are straight away delivering on this, this social hub where you can enter the game and meet other players and sort of know more about the game world, sort of show off, like earn prestige, earn weapons in a persistent way.
Okay, we've probably got time for a couple more questions. If anyone's got anything they want to ask.
Have you encountered any issues with trying to populate the huge map with interesting points of interest to make it instantly apparent to the player where they are in the world, in a unique world?
Yes, so filling out the world is an interesting one. Like some things take a lot longer than you expect, and some things are a lot easier. Like for example, we found that initially, foliage placement was quite easy, and we did a lot and a lot of kinds of variety of it that indicated where you are. I mean, the whole map being designed first gave us indication, especially given that we're going into sort of the RPG side of the story. Though it is separate to the the session-based gameplay, it gives it a style in different parts of the map, so you can tell where you are. So we already had that all planned out. It then became quite easy to place down, whether it's a beach or a higher land, or like there's supposed to be a town there. There's a lot we could do with foliage. There's some other things like rock forms, which sound really straightforward to place, but the artists were like, look, a rock wouldn't be in that direction. We have to form it in the terrain, and like we end up having to come up with algorithmic approaches and things like that to make it work. So certain things that sound really simple, just placing rocks, can take months, whereas like doing a lot of variety of foliage and going, look, we know that the map is supposed to be laid out this way, make the trees here feel different, understand there's this is a town. Some of that we found actually is very straightforward. We focused a lot on getting a very, very high quality setting within what we call the sort of tutorial area, with like outside the capital, there's a small island, which we were seeing some shots from then. So we went, look, we're going to do this to a really high quality and demo this, and that's what we're going to do a lot of our testing on over the next few months, like this focused area, so that we know what quality bars we want to hit. And we've sort of then done, to a large extent, filling that out to the rest of the map, but we do know that it's going to be a pretty mammoth task to reach where we want to be in terms of the RPG element and a varied world for that huge 16K map. So I would say we're somewhere in between at the moment with a larger map, but by having a really high quality section, and also still already, compared to what's on the market today, already a very good large map. There's a lot more we want to do about filling out the large map, and that is going to take a lot of time. We use a lot of procedural techniques, and we also benefit a lot from the fact that because we're this game that doesn't allow baked lighting, it's all dynamic. Our artists can literally dump stuff in the map constantly, and that you don't have to wait for anything, which is a huge component as well. So yeah, I think it depends a lot on the game you're making. In our case, we're quite fortunate to be a dynamic game in that sense. Yeah, some assets though take a while, some are quite quick. It's quite an interesting one. We also benefit, of course, from being a photoreal, or nearer to photoreal game, because you can take assets from the real world, and that's a huge time save for us. We couldn't create unique assets without the aid of photogrammetry and photo scans for this kind of world on the timescales that we have. It wouldn't be possible. So we're benefiting a lot from the more recent technology around PBR and photo scanning. Yeah.
I think that's about time. So, awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm thank you to James Thompson.
Thanks very much.